And my name is Linda Harper, asterisk, and I am 68 years old. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the same house where I raised my son and graded decades of student essays. As a retired teacher, my life had settled into a comfortable rhythm of gardening, book club meetings, and enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of careful saving. My world was small, safe, and predictable until it wasn't. This is the story of how a man I thought was my future stole my past, and how I fought to get it back. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Asterisk retirement, they say, is the golden age. For the first few years after my husband Tom passed away, it felt more like a waiting room. The days were long, the silence in the house was heavy, and my son David was busy with his own family and career 2 states away. I had friends, of course, like my dear Susan, who lived just down the street. We had our weekly coffee dates and book club meetings, but there was still a void, a loneliness that clung to the evenings like damp air. I had spent 40 years as Mrs. Harper, the high school English teacher, and then simply as Tom's wife. Now, I was just Linda, a widow with a pension and a quiet house. Then Ryan Peterson walked into my life. It was at a local charity gala, an event I'd almost skipped. He was volunteering, impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. He was handsome, with kind eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person there. He told me he was an independent investment advisor, helping people secure their futures. I laughed and said my future was mostly behind me. He just smiled that charming smile and said, "The best chapter is always the one you haven't read yet." It was cheesy, but in that moment, it was exactly what I wanted to hear. He was 35. A fact he was open about from the start. The age gap felt scandalous at first, but Ryan was persistent. He called the next day, asking me to lunch. He brought flowers. He remembered small details from our conversation, my love for classic literature, my passion for gardening. He wasn't just charming. He was attentive, thoughtful, and deeply respectful. He never made me feel old. He made me feel seen. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement, a flutter of something I thought was long gone. Susan was skeptical. "Linda, be careful," she'd warn over coffee. A man that young, that handsome. What does he want with a woman our age? David was even more direct during our weekly calls. "Mom, have you looked into this guy? Does he have a website? A firm? What are his credentials?" I brushed off their concerns as overprotectiveness. Ryan had answers for everything. He was an independent consultant, he explained, which gave him the freedom to offer his clients more personalized, high-yield opportunities that big, stubborn firms shy away from. He spoke of exclusive real estate ventures and emerging markets in boutique. It was a world I didn't understand, filled with jargon, self-funding, and corporate diversification. But he explained it with such patience and confidence that it all sounded perfectly logical. He showed me glossy brochures and pointed to testimonials on a sleek, professional-looking website. The romance blossomed quickly. Within a few months, Ryan was a fixture in my life. He helped me with my garden, fixed the leaky faucet I'd been ignoring for months, and sat with me on the porch swing, holding my hand as we watched the sunset. He spoke of a future together traveling, maybe buying a small cottage by the sea. It was a beautiful dream, a life I never thought I'd have a chance to live. He never asked for money, not directly. Instead, he talked about his work, about the incredible returns his clients were seeing. He'd casually mention, "My client Martha just made a 40% return on that eco-resort project in Costa Rica. She's using it to fund her grandkids' college education. The seed was planted. I have my retirement fund, a substantial sum of $450,000 that Tom and I had diligently saved over 40 years. It sat in a low-interest savings account, safe but stagnant. David, my accountant son, had always advised me to keep it that way. "It's your nest egg, Mom. Don't touch it. Don't risk it." But Ryan painted a different picture. He wasn't talking about risk. He was talking about opportunity. He spoke of making my money work for me, of turning that nest egg into a golden goose that could fund the seaside cottage, the trips to Italy, the life we dreamed of. The final push came when he proposed a specific investment, a private off-market deal to invest in a luxury coastal development project in Portugal. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he said, with guaranteed returns. The minimum buy-in was significant, but the projected payout was staggering. He told me he cared for me too much to see my life savings languish in a bank account, earning practically nothing. "Linda," he said, his voice soft and sincere, his hand covering mine. "This isn't for me. This is for us. For our future." Against my son's advice and my best friend's worried glances, I decided to trust him. It felt like a leap of faith, not into a financial scheme, but into a new life, a second chance at happiness. Ryan handled everything. He helped me set up the wire transfer from my savings account to a holding company he said was managing the project's funds. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, my hand trembling slightly as I signed the documents. He placed his hand over mine, his thumb stroking my knuckles. "You're doing the right thing," he whispered. "Our life starts now." I looked into his kind, reassuring eyes and believed him. I transferred the entire amount, every last penny of my life savings. The transfer was set to clear overnight. That evening, we celebrated with a bottle of expensive champagne he'd brought. He toasted to us, to Portugal, and to our future. It was the happiest I'd been in a decade. Asterisk. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The sun was streaming through my bedroom window, and for the first time, it didn't just feel like another day to get through. It felt like the beginning of something wonderful. I could almost smell the salty air of the Portuguese coast, hear the waves crashing on the shore. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed away my life savings just the day before. The empty champagne bottle was still on the counter, a silent testament to our celebration. Ryan had stayed over but was gone when I woke up, which wasn't unusual. He was an early riser and often went for a run or left to get a head start on his work. He'd left a single red rose in a small vase on the table with a note, "Couldn't wake my beautiful sleeping queen." Thinking of our future, all my love, my heart swelled. All my doubts, all the warnings from Susan and David felt so foolish now. This man loved me. He was building a life for us. I decided to log into my online banking portal, not out of suspicion, but out of a strange sense of finality. I wanted to see the zero balance in my savings account as a symbol, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. I typed in my password, my fingers tapping happily on the keyboard. The page loaded. I navigated to my account summary. My checking account showed its usual modest balance, and then I looked at my savings account. The balance was $0. A smile touched my lips. It was done. The money was on its way to Portugal, on its way to building our dream cottage. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a sense of serene accomplishment. To commemorate the moment, I decided to call Ryan and share in the excitement. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to a cold, robotic voice. "The number you have dialed is not in service." "Please check the number and try again," my smile faltered. That was strange. Maybe a technical issue with his phone? I tried again. Same message. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. It was probably nothing. He probably dropped his phone on his run or the battery died. I sent him a text message. Morning, darling. Phone seems to be off. Call me when you can. Love you. I stared at the screen, waiting for the little notification to appear. It never did. The message just hung there, unsent. I tried to push the rising panic down. There were a million logical explanations. I decided to check my email. Ryan and I were in constant communication, sending each other little notes and articles throughout the day. I opened my inbox. Nothing from him this morning. I typed his name into the search bar to find an old email, maybe with an alternate phone number. The search came back empty. Baffled, I checked my sent folder, my trash, my spam. Every email we had ever exchanged, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, was gone. It was as if he had never existed in my digital world. The knot in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. My hand started to shake, rattling the coffee cup against its saucer. This wasn't right. I went back to the online banking page, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clicked on the savings account, this time not with excitement, but with a dawning, sickening horror. I opened the transaction history. There it was, a wire transfer for $450,000, authorized yesterday. I scanned the details, looking for the name of the Portuguese development company he'd shown me in the brochures. The name wasn't there. Instead, the funds had been transferred to a numbered company, something generic and anonymous, and the destination wasn't a bank in Portugal. It was a small offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up so quickly, my chair screeched against the hardwood floor. I walked through the house, my home of 40 years, but it suddenly felt alien and cold. His toothbrush was gone from the bathroom. The book he'd been reading was no longer on the nightstand. The framed photo of us he'd insisted we take at the botanical gardens was missing from the mantelpiece. He had meticulously erased every physical trace of himself. I stumbled back to the kitchen, my legs weak. I looked at the single red rose on the table, its vibrant petals a cruel mockery of the affection I thought was real. I picked up the note he'd left, thinking of our future. The words, so full of promise just an hour ago, were now laced with a poison that seeped into my very soul. There was no us. There was no future. There was only the silence of a clean slate, his clean slate, and my empty one. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of my entire world collapsing. I finally understood. The man I loved didn't exist. He was a ghost who had walked into my life, stolen my future, and vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but a single perfect rose and an account balance of 0, asterisk for a full hour. I sat frozen at my kitchen table, staring at the rose. My mind was a whirlwind of denial and gut-wrenching realization. This had to be a mistake, a terrible, elaborate misunderstanding. But the evidence was everywhere, or rather, the lack of it was. He had been so careful, so precise in his departure. It wasn't a hasty retreat. It was a calculated extraction. My hands were trembling too violently to hold a phone, but I knew who I had to call. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? A man I was dating took my money. I had willingly signed the transfer forms. It felt foolish, humiliating. No, there were 2 people who, despite their warnings, would help without judgment. My son, David, and my best friend, Susan. I called Susan first. My voice was a choked whisper when she answered. Susan, can you come over? Something's happened. She must have heard the terror in my voice because she didn't ask questions. She just said, I'm on my way. While I waited, I forced myself to call David. My finger hovered over his contact photo, a smiling picture of him with his wife and 2 kids. How could I tell him that his responsible, cautious mother had been played for a fool? that I had ignored his every warning and handed over his father's legacy to a phantom. Swallowing my pride, which tasted like ash, I pressed the button. "Hey, Mom. How's it going?" His cheerful voice rang through the phone. The sound of his normality shattered my fragile composure. A sob escaped my lips, raw and ragged. "David," I cried, the word tearing from my throat. "The money, it's gone. All of it." The line went silent for a moment. "Mom, what are you talking about? What money?" "The savings, David. The nest egg. I gave it to him, to Ryan, and he's gone." I explained everything in a frantic, disjointed rush. The investment, the wire transfer, the disconnected phone, the erased emails, the missing photograph. David didn't say, "I told you so." He was an accountant, pragmatic and logical, but he was also my son. His voice was firm, cutting through my panic. "Okay, Mom. Stay right where you are. Don't touch anything. Don't delete anything. I'm booking the first flight out. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Just breathe, okay?" Just as I hung up, Susan walked in through the unlocked back door, her face etched with concern. She took one look at me, pale and shaking, and wrapped her arms around me. I collapsed into her embrace, the full weight of my catastrophe finally breaking through the shock. I told her everything, the words tumbling out between sobs. She listened patiently, holding my hand, her presence a solid, comforting anchor in my swirling nightmare. When the tears subsided, Susan, ever the practical nurse, switched from comforter to investigator. "All right, Linda," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's figure out who this man really was. You said he had a website?" Together, we went to my computer. I typed in the web address for Peterson Private Wealth, the one I had visited so many times, feeling reassured by its professional design and glowing testimonials. This time, the screen returned a blunt, sterile message. "This site can't be reached." He had taken it down. "What about the brochures?" Susan asked Dot. I rummaged through the drawer where I kept important documents, my hands still shaking. I pulled out the glossy, expensive-feeling brochure for the Portugal coastal estates. It was beautiful, filled with architectural renderings of sun-drenched villas and infinity pools overlooking the ocean. Susan took it and examined it closely. "The paper is nice," she noted, "but look at this." She pointed to the fine print at the bottom. The company address was just a P.O. box in a city I'd never heard of. The contact number was the same one Ryan had used, the one that was now out of service. We spent the next few hours trying to piece together the ghost. We searched his name online. Ryan Peterson yielded thousands of results. It was a common enough name to be anonymous. We added investment advisor and the name of our city. Nothing. No LinkedIn profile. No professional registrations, no articles or mentions in financial publications. There were a few social media profiles for men named Ryan Peterson, but none of them matched the man I knew. His digital footprint was as clean as my house had been of his physical presence. The man I had spent 6 months with, the man I had dreamed of a future with, had been a complete fabrication. His name, his profession, his history, all of it was a meticulously constructed lie designed for one purpose: to gain my trust and steal my money. The testimonials on his website were probably fake. The brochures were nothing more than props. The entire relationship had been a long con, a performance in which I was the soul. Captivated audience member. When David arrived the next morning, his face was a mask of grim determination. He hugged me tightly, then immediately set to work. He sat at my computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed I could never match. He pulled up the bank statement with the wire transfer details. "The receiving entity is Apex Global Holdings, LLC," he said, his eyes scanning the screen. "Registered in Delaware, of course. Classic shell corporation. Bank is in the Caymans. Mom, this money is likely already gone, moved through half a dozen other accounts. My last sliver of hope vanished. David saw the look on my face and softened his tone. But that doesn't mean we can't find him, he said, his voice hardening with resolve. He may have erased his presence from your life, but no one is a perfect ghost. He had to have left a trace somewhere. We just have to find it. For the first time since that horrible morning, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was anger. A cold, quiet rage began to smolder in the pit of my stomach. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my dignity, my trust, and my hope for a happy future. And I was not going to let him get away with it. Asterisk, the next few days were a blur of grim activity. David effectively turned my quiet suburban home into a war room. He set up his laptop at the dining table, which was soon covered in papers, legal pads, and empty coffee cups. Susan became our chief of staff, making sure we ate, keeping a steady supply of coffee brewing, and offering a calm, practical perspective when the frustration mounted. I was the primary source, tasked with dredging up every single memory I had of Ryan. No matter how insignificant it seemed, our first official step was filing a police report. The officer who took my statement was polite, but his expression was weary. He had heard stories like mine before. Ma'am, with offshore accounts and a fake identity, the chances of recovery are slim, he said, not unkindly. These are sophisticated criminals. We'll open a file, but I need you to be realistic. His words were discouraging, but they only fueled David's resolve. The police have limited resources for this kind of international fraud, David explained after the officer left. They're not going to dedicate a detective to hunt through digital breadcrumbs. We have to do it ourselves. Asterisk, David's expertise as an accountant was invaluable. He knew how to follow money, but now he was learning how to follow a person who had tried to leave no trail. We started with the very basics. Think, Mom, he prompted gently. Did you ever take a picture of him? Or with him? My heart sank. The one photo I had, the one on the mantelpiece he had taken. But then I remembered something. The charity gala, I said, a flicker of excitement piercing the gloom. The one where we met. They had a professional photographer. It was a long shot, but we scoured the charity's website and social media pages. After hours of scrolling through event photos, there he was. A clear, high-resolution picture of him smiling that disarming smile, a glass of champagne in his hand. He was in the background of a group shot, but it was him, unmistakably. Got him, David said, his voice low and triumphant. He saved the image and immediately ran it through several reverse image search engines. The first few searches yielded nothing, but then, on a more obscure European search engine, a hit. The same face, but with a different name, Martin Visser, appeared on an old news article from a Belgian newspaper. The headline was in Dutch, but David used an online translator. Investment manager accused of defrauding seniors. My blood ran cold. The article was 3 years old. It detailed a scheme remarkably similar to mine. A charming, sophisticated man who called himself Martin Visser had romanced and defrauded at least 4 elderly widows in Brussels before vanishing when the authorities started closing in. He was never caught. The photo in the article was grainier, and he looked slightly younger, but it was him. The same kind eyes, the same predatory smile. This is our guy, David said, his jaw tight. Ryan Peterson, Martin Visser. He's probably got a dozen other aliases. This breakthrough opened the floodgates. With a new name to search, we started digging deeper. David, using some of the paid background check services his accounting firm subscribed to, found connections between the name Martin Visser and other shell corporations. It was a complex web of lies, spanning multiple countries. We discovered he favored a specific pattern. He would set up in a new city, create a new identity society with a fake professional website and social media presence, target wealthy, lonely women of a certain age, and then vanish after about 6 to 9 months. Susan, meanwhile, took a different approach. He had to live somewhere, Linda. He couldn't have been staying with you the entire time, especially at the beginning. She was right. I remembered him mentioning he was renting a short-term corporate apartment downtown. While he got settled, we called every luxury corporate rental agency in the city. On the fifth try, we got a hit. A woman in leasing remembered him. Mr. Peterson? Yes, he was a model tenant. Paid his 3-month lease up front in cash, she said. He checked out the day before yesterday, the day he celebrated with me. David asked the leasing agent if they had any paperwork, any ID on file. Of course, she said. We have a copy of his driver's license. She emailed us a copy. The name on the license was Ryan Peterson, but the photo was our man. David knew the license had to be a high-quality fake, but it was another piece of the puzzle. The address on it was a mail forwarding service. A dead end. But the date of birth might be real. Or it might be another lie. The final piece came from an unexpected place. While cleaning out my purse a few days later, my hand brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper at the bottom. It was a receipt from a high-end coffee shop downtown, dated 2 months prior. I remembered the day clearly. I had met Ryan there for coffee. I had paid, but scribbled on the back of the receipt in my own handwriting was a name, Julian C. My mind raced. While we were waiting for our coffee, another man had approached our table. He was older, well-dressed, and Ryan had introduced him as my associate, Julian. They spoke for only a minute, something about a delayed shipment of some art pieces. It seemed insignificant at the time, but now it felt like a crucial clue. Julian C., David muttered, typing furiously. Let's assume the C is real. We'll search for art dealers, gallery owners named Julian in the tri-state area. It took hours, but we finally found him. Julian Croft, owner of a small niche gallery in the city. The gallery's website featured photos of its latest exhibition opening. And there, in the background of one of the photos, standing next to Julian Croft, was Ryan. This time he was clean-shaven, his hair styled differently, but it was him. The picture was only a month old. He was still in the city, or at least he had been. He hadn't vanished completely. He had just shed his Ryan Peterson skin and moved on. The ghost had a shadow, and his name was Julian Croft. We were no longer just victims. We were hunters, and we were closing in. Asterisk, finding Julian Croft was the turning point. We now had a tangible link to the man who had destroyed my world. David was adamant that we couldn't just go to the police with this new information. They'll go talk to Croft, he'll deny everything, tip off Ryan, and our guy will be gone for good, he reasoned. We have one shot at this. We need to lure him out into the open, and we need irrefutable proof. And so, the three of us, an accountant, a retired nurse, and a heartbroken former teacher, began to hatch a plan. The idea was simple, yet audacious. We would use Ryan's own methods against him. We would create the perfect target, a woman so wealthy, so vulnerable, and so enticing that he wouldn't be able to resist. We were going to set a honeypot trap. The first step was creating our bait, a fictional heiress. We decided on the name Isabel Beaumont, a sophisticated worldly name. We built her a backstory, a recent widow from Geneva, Switzerland, who had just inherited a vast fortune from her late husband, a European industrialist. She was relocating to the U.S. to oversee some of his stateside investments and was looking for new, exclusive opportunities. She was lonely, a bit naive about American finance, and eager to make her money grow. In short, she was Ryan's perfect victim, David. With his tech-savvy skills, went to work building Isabel's online presence. He bought a domain name and created a website for a fake Beaumont Foundation, a philanthropic organization she supposedly ran. He populated it with stock photos of charity galas and articles about her fictional late husband's business empire. He created social media profiles for her on platforms favored by the wealthy. The profiles were private, but they were there, looking legitimate. My role was the most difficult. I had to provide the insight into Ryan's psyche. What would attract him? What details would make Isabel seem real? I remembered the things he'd been drawn to with me: classic literature, expensive art, a hint of old-world elegance mixed with a touch of vulnerability. We wove these details into Isabel's online persona. Her profiles mentioned her love for first edition books and her interest in collecting modern sculpture. The final, and most crucial piece of the puzzle was Susan. We needed a voice for Isabel, someone to make the initial contact. We couldn't use a fake voice generator. It had to be real, convincing. Susan, with her calm, steady voice, was perfect. She would pose as Isabel's personal assistant, Catherine. The plan was this. Catherine would contact Julian Croft's art gallery. She would express Isabel's interest in acquiring a significant piece from one of the artists the gallery represented. The price point would be high enough to guarantee Croft's personal attention. During the conversation, Catherine would casually mention that her employer, the recently widowed Mrs. Beaumont, was also seeking a new private financial advisor to manage her considerable portfolio, as she was dissatisfied with the large, impersonal banks. She would drop hints about Isabel's vast wealth and her interest in discreet, high-yield opportunities. It was a carefully baited hook. We were betting that Croft, being Ryan's accomplice, would see the dollar signs and pass the lead on to his star performer. The day we put the plan into action, my heart was in my throat. We gathered around the speakerphone on my dining table as Susan made the call. She was brilliant. Her tone was the perfect blend of professional, slightly haughty, and confidential. She spoke to Croft for nearly 20 minutes, discussing art, and then seamlessly transitioned to the topic of financial management. "Mr. Croft, forgive my forwardness," Susan said, her voice smooth as silk, "but you seem to be a man of impeccable taste and discretion. My employer, Mrs. Beaumont, has found the large American banks to be rather unimaginative. She is looking for a private advisor, someone who understands the European mindset and can handle a substantial and complex portfolio." I don't suppose you would know of such an individual. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I held my breath. "As a matter of fact," Croft said slowly, his voice laced with newfound interest, "I might know the perfect person. A very talented, very private consultant who works with a select few clients. Let me reach out to him. Perhaps he can get in touch with you. That would be wonderful," Susan said calmly. "But please stress that Mrs. Beaumont values privacy above all else." When she hung up, the three of us sat in silence for a moment before breaking into relieved, nervous laughter. The bait was in the water. Now we had to wait and see if the shark would bite. We didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Catherine received an email. The sender's name was Alex Sterling. The email was brief, professional, and confident. He wrote that he had been referred by their mutual acquaintance, Julian Croft, and understood that a Mrs. Beaumont was seeking bespoke financial counsel. He suggested a preliminary phone call to discuss her needs. The name was different, but we knew it was him. David had set up a new, untraceable phone number for the assistant. The call was scheduled for the next day. This time, we were prepared. David had a recording device connected to the phone. Susan again played the part of Catherine while I sat beside her, coaching her on the kind of language Ryan or Alex would respond to, the specific vulnerabilities he would look to exploit. He was just as smooth, just as charming as he had been with me. His voice was a velvety baritone filled with confidence and empathy. He listened intently as Susan, playing her part, described her employer's situation. He used the same phrases, the same reassuring tone. By the end of the 30-minute call, he had scheduled an in-person meeting with Isabel for the following week. He wanted to personally present a few exclusive opportunities. He had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. The trap was set. Now we just had to be ready to spring it. Asterisk, the week leading up to the meeting was the most nerve-wracking of my life. The plan was in motion, but the risks were enormous. If he suspected anything, he would disappear again, this time for good. We had to create a flawless illusion. The meeting was set to take place at a suite in a 5-star hotel downtown. David used a corporate credit card from a dormant company his firm owned to book it, ensuring the name Isabel Beaumont was on the reservation. The location had to be luxurious enough to befit a wealthy heiress, but also controllable. David chose a suite with an adjoining room, where he and a private investigator he'd hired would be monitoring everything. The private investigator, a former police detective named Frank, was a godsend. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man who understood the stakes. He equipped the suite with discreet, high-quality audio and video recording equipment. "The DA will love this," he grunted as he positioned a tiny camera in a flower arrangement. A confession on a silver platter is what we're after. The most daunting role fell to Susan. She had to be in the room, playing the part of Catherine, the protective assistant. I wanted to be there myself to face him, but everyone agreed it was too risky. My presence would expose the entire charade instantly. So I was relegated to the monitoring room next door with David and Frank, a helpless spectator in the final act of my own drama. On the day of the meeting, my stomach was a mess of knots. Susan looked the part, dressed in a chic, understated business suit, her hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She looked every bit the part of a high-powered European assistant. Before she went into the suite, she squeezed my hand. "We're going to get him, Linda," she said, her eyes firm. We took our places in the adjoining room. A large monitor showed us a live feed from the 2 cameras in the suite. We wore headsets to hear the audio clearly. I watched the screen, my heart pounding with every tick of the clock dot at precisely 3 p.m. There was a soft knock on the suite door. Susan opened it, and he walked in. It was him. Seeing him on the screen, so close yet so far, sent a jolt through me. He was calling himself Alex Sterling now, and he looked the part. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried an expensive leather briefcase. His smile was just as brilliant, just as practiced. "As I remembered, Catherine," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "A pleasure to finally meet you in person. Is Mrs. Beaumont here?" Susan played her part perfectly. "Mrs. Beaumont has been unexpectedly delayed," she said coolly. "A call from her bankers in Zurich. She asked me to begin without her. She trusts my judgment implicitly. This was a calculated move suggested by Frank. It would put him slightly off balance and force him to pitch his scheme to the Pat Buttons assistant, making him less likely to be on guard. He recovered quickly, his smile never wavering. "Of course. Shall we?" He sat on the plush sofa and opened his briefcase, laying out the same kind of glossy brochures and fabricated documents he had shown me. This time, the investment was a private equity stake in a biomedical tech firm. It was the same scam, just with a different wrapper. For the next 20 minutes, he laid on the charm and the fabricated expertise. David recorded every word, every lie. Finally, Frank gave David a nod. It was time. David spoke into a small microphone connected to Susan's discreet earpiece. "Ask him about his time in Brussels." Susan waited for a pause in his presentation. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her tone casual, "your accent is difficult to place. You sound American, but your name and your familiarity with European finance make me wonder. Have you ever spent much time working in Brussels?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. "I've passed through," he said vaguely. "On business, really?" Susan pressed, her voice still light. "My employer had a dear friend there, another widow, who had a dreadful experience with an advisor a few years ago. A charming man named Martin Visser. It's a terrible story. He vanished with her entire life savings. The color drained from his face. He stared at Susan, his charming facade cracking like thin ice. He knew. He knew this was a trap. His eyes darted toward the door, and before that, David's voice came. Not through the earpiece, but through a speaker we had hidden in the room. He was in our city. He went by the name Ryan Peterson then. At the sound of David's voice, he shot to his feet. At the same moment, the door to the adjoining room opened. I stood there, flanked by David and Frank. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry, that I would be strong. He saw me, and for a split second, his mask of composure crumbled completely. I saw not a master criminal, but a cornered, pathetic man. "Linda," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "That's a name you haven't used in a while, isn't it, Ryan?" I said, my voice shaking but clear. "Or is it Martin or Alex? It must be so hard to keep track." He backed away, his hands slightly raised. "This is a mistake. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Frank said, stepping forward and flashing his PI badge. "And we have everything on tape. The pitch, the lies, the shell companies. We also have a lovely high-resolution photo of you from the charity gala, which we've already shared with some of your other clients in Belgium. They're quite eager to speak with you." His face went ashen. He knew it was over. There was no escape. He had walked into a trap from which there was no exit. He sank back onto the sofa, the fight completely gone from him. He had come to pitch an unforgettable investment, and he had found one. He had invested his freedom in one last con, and the return was a lifetime of regret. The police were already on their way. Asterisk, the aftermath was not the explosive, cinematic climax I might have imagined. It was a slow, grinding process of legal proceedings and financial untangling. Ryan, whose real name turned out to be Philip Mackin, was a career criminal. Our meticulously gathered evidence, the recordings, the trail of shell corporations, the connection to Julian Croft, who quickly turned on Philip to get a lighter sentence, and the testimonies from his Belgian victims was overwhelming. He was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. There would be no charming his way out of this. The legal battle was long and emotionally draining. I had to give a victim impact statement in court. Standing there, looking at the man who had so thoroughly dismantled my life, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I didn't yell or cry. I simply told the truth. I spoke of the trust he had cultivated and the future he had stolen, not just the money, but the sense of safety and hope I had finally allowed myself to feel again. I spoke for myself and for the other women whose names I now knew, the widows in Brussels, a divorcee in France, a retiree in Spain. I was their voice, in the end. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12. It wasn't a moment of triumph and celebration for me. There was no joy in seeing another human being caged. But there was a profound sense of relief, of closure. The ghost that had haunted me was finally vanquished. Asterisk, recovering the money was another mountain to climb. David, working with forensic accountants and international law enforcement, managed to track and freeze a portion of the funds. As it turned out, my $450,000 had been Philip's retirement score. He hadn't had time to launder and hide all of it before we caught him. After months of legal wrangling, the authorities were able to recover nearly 70 cents on the dollar. I got back just over $300,000, It was a significant loss, but it wasn't total ruin. It was enough. Life didn't just snap back to the way it was before. The wound he left was deep, and the scar would always be there. I became more cautious, more guarded. It took a long time to trust again, not just others, but my own judgment. There were days when the shame and embarrassment washed over me, when I heard Susan's and David's warnings echoing in my mind. But those feelings began to fade, replaced by something else. Resilience. Asterisk, I didn't buy a cottage by the sea. The dream he had sold me was tainted. Instead, I used a small portion of the recovered money to do something for myself. I took a trip not to Portugal, but to the Grand Canyon with Susan. We stood on the edge of that vast, magnificent expanse, and I felt a sense of perspective I hadn't felt in a long time. My personal canyon of betrayal and loss seemed small in comparison to my relationship with my son. David was forged into something stronger than ever before. He never once blamed me. He stood by me, fought for me, and in the process, the parent-child roles reversed. I saw him not just as my son, but as a formidable, brilliant, and deeply compassionate man.